Hello and welcome to our Q&A session for the Lawns to Legumes Spring 2025 grant season. So we'll mainly be answering program-related questions that were asked in last week's kickoff webinar. If you have not had a chance to watch that kickoff webinar yet, we do have the recording posted on the Grantee Guide webpage. And that webinar gives an overview of the Lawns to Legumes program and what you need to know to complete your pollinator habitat project this spring. Tonight, in addition to answering questions that came up during last week's webinar, we may have some time at the end to answer any questions that you'd like to submit in the Q&A feature here on Zoom. And to submit a question, all you have to do is click on that Q&A button on your bottom bar and submit your question. Like last week, you can also upvote other questions from participants by just clicking the thumbs up icon, and that'll help us prioritize the most popular questions. And if we're not able to get to your question or your question's not answered by our content from today, or it's not answered on the Grantee Guide, you can always reach out to our L2L helpline email, and we can put that email address in the chat if you haven't had a chance to see it yet. And also, like last week, this Q&A session will be recorded. We'll send out an email with that recording, and it will also be posted on the Grantee Guide on bluethumb.org. So most of you probably already met us at the kickoff webinar or watched the recording. But again, Lawns to Legumes program staff are coming from the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources, Blue Thumb, and Metro Blooms. So today we have myself here. My name is Megan. I'm from the Metro Blooms and Blue Thumb team. Tonight, we also have Dan from the Board of Water and Soil Resources, as well as John, who will be going through some of our questions, and Graciela, who will be in the chat and the Q&A tonight. And we're excited to be working with you. We got lots of good questions coming in. So before we dive in, just a bit on the format for this hour. So we'll first be going through questions that were pre-submitted through either the webinar or the helpline. And then in the remaining time, hopefully there'll be at least a few minutes, we'll go through any live questions. Without further ado, we'll be going through questions in this order, kind of based on these categories: planting, site prep, maintenance, eligible expenses, reimbursement request, and then some other miscellaneous questions that came in. So let's dive in. I'm going to pass it to Dan, who will be starting with some planting related questions.
Okay, thanks, Megan. And I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight and participating in pollinator conservation. Our first question: can my project be a combination of project types, such as pocket planting plus an adjacent native tree? The question is yes, you can do multiple project types. We talked about several project types during the kickoff webinar. Second question: can I add or expand onto an existing garden for my Lawns to Legumes project? Question is yes for that as well. Remember to take before and after pictures. So that would be the main thing with an existing area. Just take before and after pictures of that area, and so you have that documented. Next question: can these funds be used for prairie restoration? They definitely can. So if you want to seed an area of prairie, that's fine through this program, or use a combination of seed and containerized plants. We just ask that you record that as a pollinator meadow when you're recording your pollinator planting. And then what suggestions do you have for areas that you're interested in planting but have invasive species? This is a pretty common question. It can be really hard to get a pollinator planting established if you have invasive plants. So it's really important to get control of those right away before you do your planting. Sometimes we recommend starting with small areas first. so that you're not taking on too much with that conversion. If you're taking on a larger area, you may need to do repeated mowing to keep the weeds down and keep them from seeding. So that is a pretty common practice, particularly early in the spring when they're going to start flowering and producing seeds. It's also pretty common to mulch beds as a way to suppress invasive species. And then pretty common also to use cardboard to suppress weeds. It's a good practice. Sometimes layers of cardboard, cutting holes in the cardboard to install your plants. Edging can also be really helpful to keep invasive plants from moving into your lawn or other parts of your planting. You can use edging within your planting. And then frequent weeding may be needed if you have invasive plants. So you may be out there more often trying to weed them and keep control of them so that they don't spread and start overtaking your native plants. Next question is, how do I establish a pollinator lawn if the site is primarily covered with creeping Charlie? Which is a pretty common question as well. We have a lot of participants with creeping Charlie, and in trying to address that, the method that we covered during the kickoff webinar for establishing a pollinator lawn was overseeding. It's the most effective or most common method. Other methods are needed when you have creeping Charlie to suppress the creeping Charlie. If you're dealing with a lot of aggressive weeds on your site, we recommend attending the Pollinator Lawns project webinar on March 11th. So that's an opportunity to hear more detail about pollinator lawns and how to do preparation for them. But if you are dealing with more extensive weed pressure and want to do a pollinator lawn, you really need to start with a blank slate. So using a sod kicker or sod cutter to remove the sod is usually a recommended practice. Just clearing all of that out so that you're down to bare soil. You can also use cardboard, usually for about a season, to really suppress those weeds underneath before you pull the cardboard off and seed into that. There are more details on the turf alternative section of the plan, a project page on bluethumb.org. That's bluethumb.org, the turf alternative section. And it may be more practical and successful to do a small pocket planting this first year if you need more time to prep your lawn area. So that is a consideration. You might decide that you just need more time to prep a lawn that has a lot of weeds, and it may be better just to do a pocket planting for this season. And I'll turn it over to Megan.
Great, thanks, Dan. So this question is, if we live on a small pond, are there any options for this area? So yes, if you live on a pond, if you have lakeshore property, you're welcome to do a native planting along your shoreline. We do have a number of resources specifically for shoreline planting. To bring up the plan a project page again, we have a section called shoreline stabilization. So I highly recommend checking that out. We have more detailed guidance on design and some plants that do better on shorelines as well. So hop on over there, but yes, you're more than welcome to do a shoreline planting. Next question, are there any recommended natives that can survive the winter in a container? So yes, in general, our native perennials are designed to go through a dormant season during the winter in Minnesota where they're gonna die off in terms of the above ground material, but their roots underground will survive on to the next season, and that goes for container plantings as well. I won't list specific plant names here, but there are a few container planting design templates with recommended plants on our resources page. So if you go on bluethumb.org and there's a section called Learn, then you can go to the resources page and get those recommended plants for container gardening. What is the definition of residential? My small farm is 4 miles away from my house. So during our last webinar, we probably used the term residential planting a number of times. But to clarify, if you do have lands that you want to do your project on that's not like right next to your house, that's perfectly fine. as long as you're doing your project that's like on an address or near the address that you applied for your grant with. If you do want to do or have to do a project on an address that is different than the one that you applied for the grant with, please contact the L2L helpline and we can work with you on that. Okay, so Minneapolis has been talking about changing the rules around boulevard gardens. It would be helpful to learn what the current rules are. So as mentioned in the kickoff webinar, if you're planning to do a pocket planting in your boulevard, so that strip of land between the sidewalk and the street, it's important to check what your city or town's plant height restrictions are for those areas. A lot of cities have boulevard height restrictions for plants just for safety and visibility reasons. I won't spend too much time on Minneapolis just because I know not everybody lives in Minneapolis. But currently the Minneapolis restrictions are plantings shouldn't exceed 36 inches in height on boulevards. And if they're within 20 feet, I believe, of an intersection or driveway, or within 5 feet of a public utility fixture, they can't exceed 18 inches. And yes, the Minneapolis City Council is going to be voting on a potential boulevard ordinance that will amend what the current rules are. That vote hasn't happened yet. It's scheduled to happen on February 25. And if that change passes, then unfortunately the restrictions are going to be a bit lower. It looks like if it's planting is within 40 feet of an intersection or within 10 feet of a driveway, the plants can't be taller than 18 inches as opposed to the 36 inches before. And if that change does happen, we can definitely send out a communication to you all just so you can be clear on that, because we want to make sure that you can keep your planting if you do put it in a boulevard. Okay, can a pocket planting be done around an existing tree or shrub? So yes, you are more than welcome to do a pocket planting around or under a tree or shrub that you have. There are a number of shade-loving natives, and we do have a design template with some recommendations for plants that prefer like shady and dry sites, which are really common under trees. I'm also going to call out a resource by local pollinator expert Heather Holm. It's called Soft Landings. So if you just type soft landings in Google and Heather, I'm sure it'll come up. But we'll see if we can put it in the chat at some point too. And there's a whole list up there with suggestions for under trees. But in general, there's lots of shade-loving native plants that you can put under a tree. And then we've been getting a number of questions around, are there certain plants that work best in shade, in sun, in a very clay soil type or very compact soil? So the answer is yes. Different native plants will have different sun and soil preferences. In general, native plants are resilient and can adapt to different conditions, but they also definitely have their preferences. I'm going to direct you to our Blue Thumb Plant Finder, which we mentioned during the kickoff webinar, that has filters that let you search for native plants based on whether you have a sunny location, shady, soil type, as well as lots of other categories like blooming time, height of the plant, and even things like pollinator value. So if you go to bluethumb.org, you'll see right in the top right of the menu that plant finder that you can check out. This question is, do you need to harden off native plants purchased from a nursery? So again, native plants are resilient. If you bought them from a nursery that grew them outdoors or a retailer that had them outdoors, you're not going to need to do much before planting them. if you can, like when we're in the spring and summer and there's hot days, try purchasing or getting your plants delivered on a milder day. That's not going to put too much heat pressure on the plants while you're transferring them and planting them. If it is a hot day, you can put them like in a shaded spot when they're sitting waiting to be planted. And just in general, it's good to watch for signs of stress in your plants when they're still in their containers. If like they're starting to look wilted or droopy, do make sure you're giving them a good water before and after planting. Like if you buy them, but then it's not a few days until you're ready to plant them, just make sure that you're watering them regularly. Okay, so someone asked, I noticed a reference to an equation to calculate the depth of your rain garden. So, yes, there is an equation that exists to figure out what depth works best for your rain garden so it can drain the rainwater that collects. And we have that available on the rain garden section of the Plan a Project page. If you are interested in doing a rain garden, I would recommend looking at that page and kind of seeing what would be involved before you make that decision, just because there are some extra steps involved and you may or may not want to hire help to do that. But you can find that equation and more on our rain gardens page. And I'm going to pass it to John now to do some site prep questions.
All right. First question, what do we do with disposed sod if it's not good quality? You'll want to check what yard waste disposal sites are close to you. Sod is not usually accepted as part of like curbside compost recycling programs. Most city websites have a list of yard waste disposal sites. And some cities, you have to be a resident and then you can dump there for free. So that's a good place to check. Some municipalities have stopped accepting soil and sod at yard waste sites because of jumping worms. If that's the case, you may still be able to find like a landscape supply center that does industrial composting at a high enough temperature to kill those off. So they might accept that kind of yard waste too. Your other option is, and then this is the lowest kind of carbon option, is to not transfer it anywhere and keep it on the site. Can you think of clever ways to use it? You can create a small berm as part of your planting. You can fill in a low spot next to your foundation, maybe, or find an out of sight corner to spread it, or at the bottom of at the bottom part of a raised bed to kind of as filler material. It's all good ideas. You can also flip it over and then kind of lay it with newspaper or cardboard, like the sheet mulching method, to just make sure you kill it off. Do pollinator lawns require specific soil types or conditions? They are effective on a variety of soil conditions. You can look at the product details for the B-Lawn mix you're thinking of buying. Generally, they're more effective and they flower more on sunnier sites. Though Twin Cities Seed has a mix that is better suited to shady sites as well. Is it beneficial to add compost to the soil? I'm working with heavily compacted clay. In most cases, most of you don't need to add any compost to your soil. Your native plants are adapted to our native soils. They should do just fine in your original soil. Just put some mulch on top of the open dirt, 2 to 4 inches, to prevent weeds from growing and keep the ground from eroding or being compacted, or drying out too quickly. Mulch does wonders for all kinds of things. That being said, if you have heavily compacted soil, adding a little compost can help, especially when you're starting a new planting. Compost can also help retain soil moisture and add some nutrients to the soil, all good for plant health. You could put a little handful of compost in each planting hole as you're planting the plants, and or work 1 to 2 inches of compost into the top few inches of your soil before planting. Landscaping companies and nurseries sell compost in bulk. It's usually your best bet if you're looking to get a lot of it. Yeah. Should a soil test be done for native plants? Again, native plants are used to native soils, so they shouldn't need to be amended. However, if you're concerned about your soil, if all the plants you've ever tried to grow in it have struggled in it, if you're also trying to grow food in it, you can do a soil test, which is not a reimbursable expense through the program, but you can certainly do it. The University of Minnesota Soil Testing Lab offers soil tests. I think it's about $20 for a basic panel of the number of common contaminants. If you want to take a different approach, you can bring a sample of your soil to your local native plant nursery and ask them what plants would do better in your soil. They're not going to do a chemical analysis, but they'll, be able to tell how much sand or clay is. Lawn garden won't be possible unless we stop mowing at this HOA. Is there someone who can guide me through that? Working within the requirements of a homeowners association can be challenging. If a pollinator lawn is not an option for you, you could ask your HOA about doing a small pocket planting in one section or corner of your yard. And if that fails, you could see about having some small containers of native plants. We have tips for talking with your neighbors or HOAs about native plantings at this link that I'll share in the chat here. And we also have on our website information about native container plantings if you have to go that route too.
Okay, we're moving on to maintenance questions. And our first question is about herbivore protection. What are mesh nets? Are they available for purchase? I have bunnies and deer in my neighborhood. Mesh nets are essentially woven netting that comes in a variety of materials. Some garden centers carry them. You can also find them online. Any sort of wire basket can also work as a net to cover individual plants. If it's too difficult to fence your entire area, some plants may be more prone to being nibbled on than other ones, so you may only have to cover up some of them. The cost-effective option is also buying mini trash baskets. Sometimes you can find those at secondhand stores or pretty inexpensive, so that can be another option for covering up some plants. And then how do you split plants? Splitting plants is a really good way to increase the size of your gardens. It's a good way to keep the plants healthy too. Sometimes you get overcrowding within gardens, so it's actually beneficial to split some of the plants and spread them around. Spring or fall is a good time to separate plants, particularly when the plants are going dormant, so that they're not going to be stressed when you're moving them around. We recommend only dividing mature plants, so plants that are 3 years or older, so that they're mature and can handle the transplanting. It's important to water. We recommend watering the day before you're going to transplant, so the plants are well hydrated before you move them. You can dig up the root ball and then try to keep the root system intact. You can separate it with your hands or with a spade to divide the root ball. Sometimes the soil will fall off, sometimes it'll stay on. If you're keeping it within your own yard, it's good actually if the soil stays on. And then you would just want to water after you've replanted those plants that you've separated. And then how is the best way to get rid of excessive aggressive native plants like goldenrod? The goldenrods that we have in Minnesota are native. Canada goldenrod is the most common one that ends up showing up in gardens by itself. We don't typically plant it because it's a pretty aggressive native plant. And there are ways to keep it at bay within plantings. We don't want it to take over. So trying to keep it from overcrowding plants by removing stems, like clipping it near the ground periodically, or pulling, particularly after rainfall, is beneficial because it'll pull out a bit better for any aggressive plants in the garden after it rains. Dividing the transplant. So if it's a plant you want to keep, you don't want to fully remove it, you can move it somewhere else on the property, give it to a neighbor. So it might be ways to save some of those plants. That might be the case for asters because many asters are a little aggressive. So you might want to thin those out from time to time. So you can essentially do that separation of the plants and move them around. You can also deadhead the plants, which is a term for removing the flowers after they've finished blooming. And so that you're preventing seed from moving around. So you can collect that seed after they're done blooming and providing pollinator services just to decrease the risk of them spreading by seed. Edging can also be effective for keeping some plants that spread underground. And that's true with Canada goldenrod. It has rhizomes, underground stems that spread and can form bigger areas. So having edging, even within some plantings on the edge of plantings, can help keep that plant and other more aggressive plants from moving. And then when you're starting off, particularly for smaller gardens, we usually recommend using plants that are less aggressive. And we have a filter for that in our plant finder. So you could pick plants that are going to be less aggressive and not spread aggressively, which is a good strategy for a small planting. And I'll turn it back over to Megan.
Great. I'm going to go over some questions related to eligible expenses. So in this first question, someone is wondering if their soil and water conservation district, they sell native plants, and wondering if that could be acceptable to get reimbursed. So the answer is yes. In addition to the native plant retailers that are across our state, your local soil and water conservation district, or SWCD as they're often called, they may sell native plant kits and trees often during the spring to their residents. So you may want to check out your local SWCD website. And actually around this time of year, many are starting to put up pre-orders for their annual sales. And on a similar note, I do want to mention that during the spring, lots of different organizations such as Minnesota Master Gardeners holds annual native plant sales. And these are also a good option for getting native plants. As per usual, just make sure that you're avoiding cultivars, which are not reimbursable. We did, on the Blue Thumb website, we did put up a blog post just last week that lists the dates of native plant sales happening throughout the state this spring. So if we could get the link in the chat there, that would be great. And then with those like in-person plant sales, if you don't get an itemized receipt, just remember to keep a list of the species you purchased or take a picture of those plant tags. Can I use Dutch elm wood chips for mulch? So yes, we did recommend specifically double shredded hardwood mulch in the kickoff webinar. And we recommended that for a number of reasons. Those mulch help locks in place easier so it doesn't get washed away or eroded during rain events. But any type of mulch is reimbursable. We do prefer if you can find non-dyed mulch, however. Yeah, I jumped ahead here. So this person says they had a large amount of shredded mulch delivered last fall. However, they do have color added. Can we use this? So yes, while we do prefer not using dyed mulch, you are able to use that. Keep in mind that we would not be able to reimburse you for this mulch since the program can only reimburse purchases made after the date that you received your grant award, which was January 15. So you can use that mulch for your project, but the program just won't be able to reimburse it. Next question, does the grant only cover products or also services? Having to get rid of invasive plants, for example. Answer is yes. Please check out the eligible expenses guide. You can be reimbursed for hiring helpers or services, whether that be getting consultations, design work, installation. It could also involve essential site prep work like removing invasive plants. Just remember that your project focus must be on the addition of new native plants. So as long as that service you're hired is for that purpose, it can be reimbursed. And of course, that service needs to be done and paid for within your grant period. So after January and before the July 15 deadline for it to be reimbursed. And then one other note on that, if you are hiring a neighbor or a family member, etc., to help you, and you're just using cash or a check and you don't really have like a receipt you can use for that, we did make a receipt template that you can print out and have your helper sign, and that is linked on the eligible expenses guide. Are we restricted to only buying plugs or seeds, or can we purchase mature plants? So yes, you're welcome to purchase mature, larger native plants if you'd like. Minnesota native plant seeds, plugs, and plants are all eligible for reimbursement. This person is wondering if pavers to walk through a pollinator meadow are reimbursable. So unfortunately, no. Edging is reimbursable. So if you're using a material to make a border for your project, but if you're buying materials for like a pathway, that would not be considered part of your planting. So it would not be reimbursable. You're welcome to purchase those with your own funds though, if you'd like to have that as a feature in your project. This person is wanting us to go in more detail regarding serviceberry bushes. What kinds should they buy for them to be eligible? So serviceberry trees and shrubs are native to Minnesota and eligible for reimbursement. And cultivars of serviceberry are actually one of those cultivars on our exception list. So in almost all cases, the program does not reimburse for cultivars. However, we do have a few trees and a few pollinator lawn plants where we do accept and reimburse for cultivars, and any serviceberry cultivar variety can be reimbursed by the program. Where can I find eligible native trees and shrubs? So best place to check first is our native plants, nurseries, and retailers page, which is linked on the grantee guide on bluethumb.org. On all of those retailer listings, there'll be a note there whether or if trees and shrubs are sold. It can be tricky to find native trees and shrubs that are not cultivars. Cultivars of native trees and shrubs are a lot more common than plants, so just be careful of that. To call out one retailer specifically, Outback Nursery in Hastings offers a lot of great native tree options, and I believe they offer delivery too. So you might want to check that out first if that is convenient for you. Okay, and I'm going to cover just a couple of reimbursement request questions that we had. So some receipts are not detailed. Will we need to keep or document each species purchased? We did go over this a little bit in the kickoff webinar. So if your receipt doesn't like list the actual names of each plant that you bought, please just make a list of those plant names. And alternatively, as I mentioned, you can save the plant tags and take a picture of those. And just a tip to maybe help you with that tracking, we did recently develop a spreadsheet called the Project Tracker spreadsheet, where you can kind of list all of your expenses. You can find it on the grantee guide. It's at the very top of the section called Plan and Install Your Project. And if one of our staff could put the direct link in the chat too, that would be great. All right, this person is planning to order a Prairie Moon semi-shade woodland garden kit. Can they order it that way as a kit for reimbursement, or do they have to order the individual plants? Good question. So a number of the native plant retailers on our list offer kits, so basically sets of multiple curated native plants. And if you do purchase a kit from one of the retailers on our list, it's going to generally be okay if the receipt is not itemized. Where our team is already familiar with what the retailers on our list offer, and those kits have been approved by our team. If you're buying the kit from a retailer that's not on your list, it would be great if you could upload a list of the plants or a photo of the plant tags so that we can verify what is in there. And if you're not sure, just upload the list and that'll make it easier for our team. Okay, I'm going to pass it to John for some miscellaneous questions.
All right, all the catch-all. Have you run into any issues around folks with bee sting allergies? We have not heard of any horror stories through the program yet. Many of the native bees we're trying to attract with our plantings either don't sting or only sting if they feel threatened. That said, here's some tips that you can keep in mind to safely coexist with bees. One, you can choose a planting option that only takes up a part of your yard. Native pocket plantings only require a small portion of your yard and leave plenty of room for recreation. We often recommend you put a pocket planting in the corner of your yard that you're never in anyways, because that's part of a lawn that has no reason to exist. Yeah, you can keep that some distance away from you. For the most part, bees are not aggressive and prefer to keep to themselves unless you interact with them directly. They are most active during the warmest parts of the day between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. If a bee does get close, try to remain calm and not swat. They are curious about you, may have confused you for a flower, if you smell sweet or are wearing bright colors. And then lastly, you can wear shoes, especially on a bee lawn. If you're worried about stepping on them, the most threatening you can do to a bee is to step on it. For more information about sharing spaces with bees, check out this resource here. Do you have any promotional materials that we can share with neighbors, friends, or relatives as we talk with them about the benefits of native plants? You're welcome to print out any of the materials we have. They're all downloadable on our resources page at Blue Thumb here. We also have a limited number of smaller postcard size handouts and bookmarks. You can contact the L2L helpline if you are interested in that. I never got a link to join the Hive, not even in the emails listed in the webinar. How can I find it? The link to the Hive is included in the welcome email newsletter we send and in the email that was sent to you after you confirmed your grant. Here is a direct link to join in case you need it. Can we have access to the Hive after the project is completed? Of course you can. You'll continue to be able to have access after the spring grant period, but program staff won't be monitoring it for questions quite as frequently. May I use the Hive to offer gardening services? There is a chat space in the Hive called Marketplace, which would be a very reasonable place for you to share about your offerings. And can I apply more than once for the grant? To give as many people as possible the opportunity to start a Lawns to Legumes project, we can only award one grant per individual. However, your city, county, or local soil and water conservation district or watershed district may have similar native planting grant opportunities. We list some of those in this recent blog post. I'll share that link.
All right. We made great time. And we finished the questions that were sent in previously. It looks like we do have a few questions that came in the Q&A. So I'm going to go through those now. To bring up the first one just briefly, Kelly asked, I read recently that this grant may be canceled. Is that true? Not exactly. So Lawns to Legumes is a state-funded program, and there has been some developments in that the program was not included in the governor's budget starting in 2026. And unfortunately, there's also been a couple of bills introduced proposing to stop future funding. We're not going to get into that here. What I can say is that your spring 2025 grant is not going away. You will be reimbursed for your project. If you're interested in learning more about questions around future funding, we do have a social media post up on that on Blue Thumb. If you go to our Facebook page or Instagram page. We have a question asking, are any of the recommended plants toxic to dogs? Dan, would you like to take on this question?
Yeah, the only one I can think of might be a native garlic or onion plant that you wouldn't want dogs to eat. I don't think they're attracted to those, so I don't think that's usually a problem. Only other native plant that I can think of is wild grapes. Grapes are not good for dogs, but those are not being planted typically for these types of plantings.
Yep. Okay, another question that came in is potting soil reimbursable if I am using it to start seeds for my new garden? And indeed, in the eligible expenses guide, soil and potting soil is only reimbursable for those container projects or if you're planting in a raised bed. And unfortunately, the program does not reimburse like containers or pots if you are starting seeds. And I believe the main reason for that is that the grant timeline kind of isn't necessarily set up for a project of starting seeds and then transplanting them to grow them. You're welcome to do that if you think it'll work for your project, but we don't reimburse for seed starting materials. Next question asks, can I use a homemade deterrent for deers and rabbits organic materials. They don't want to harm the pollinators. Yes, you are welcome to do that. That won't penalize you or prevent you from getting reimbursed from your project. When it comes to reimbursable expenses, the program only reimburses that like fencing or barrier material and not deterrents, but you are free to use that homemade deterrent for your project. Okay, this is a two-part question here. Do you have a filter for things like native fruits? On our plant finder, I don't think there is a filter for fruit producing trees. I think let me see, do we have a place where we list edible trees? If you go on our resources page, we do have a few plant lists, and some of the ones on our native tree lists are edible options, and there are a few. Serviceberry is one, elderberry is another. Dan or John, maybe you can answer some more off the top of your head, but there are a few good native fruiting options.
Black cherry, choke cherry, and black chokeberry are three other ones.
Right, thank you. Okay, let's see. Dana mentions you can get free wood mulch from chipdrop.com. ChipDrop is a good option. You can get mulch at a pretty low cost. One thing I will warn you with ChipDrop is that they give you a lot of mulch. So maybe make a plan to split some up with your neighbors or a friend. Someone asks on the Blue Thumb Plant Finder, it has herbivore sensitivity and low, medium, high are the options there. So if you press the high herbivore sensitivity, that means it's going to give you plants that are very sensitive to animals that eat them. So plants that don't do well with pressure from deers and rabbits. If you filter for plants that have low sensitivity, that means they're going to be more resilient and resistant against critters who are trying to munch on them. And brings up a point that if you're watering your plants a lot, it could raise your water bill. So that is true. And I guess maybe just a comment to add to that is consider installing a rain barrel. That is a great option for collecting rainwater and then using that to water your plants. If you're in the Twin Cities metro area, there's a group called, I believe it's the Recycling Association of Minnesota. They do an annual rain barrel sale that is usually starting in March. And you can order a rain barrel at, there is an upfront cost. Our program does not reimburse for rain barrels, but just a suggestion if you're looking for ways to water your plants without having to continually deal with a larger water bill. We have somebody wondering about planting on a septic mound. There are certain plants that are more recommended for on septic mounds. I believe that M&L, which is one of our partner retailers, they actually have a plant kit specifically for plantings on a septic mound. So you may want to look into that. And I see that John might be typing some additional comments too.
Just sharing the link.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, I would add there, Megan, any native plants that have really deep tap roots you'd want to avoid. And then some of the taller native grasses like big blue stem or Indian grass have roots that go pretty deep and can get into drain tile. So those would be plants to avoid. A lot of our dry prairie plants don't have as deep of roots, so those can be pretty good options on a septic system.
All right, thank you. Next question, can I convert an existing garden to a native planting? That answer is yes. You don't need to like start from scratch on a new garden bed. As long as, I think we mentioned, as long as you're taking a before picture of what the garden looks like now, you're adding some native plants to it, and then taking an after photo, that will be a viable project.
And Megan, I'll just add there that it's okay if there's non-natives that are left there as well, and you're just adding natives into an existing planting.
Yeah, totally. Another question, what do you think of planting seeds in milk bottle early in the soil? So that is a method called winter seed sowing. And as we have another person replied, it's also known as the milk jug method. That can be a good option if you're wanting to start plants from seeds and not wanting to buy a bunch of containers like the other question we had. We do actually have some tutorial resources on winter seed sowing. I don't know if maybe John or Graciela, you can find some of those, but I'll tell you how to get to them. On our resources page on bluethumb.org, if you go to I think it's the DIY guide section, we have a winter seed sowing how to. And then if you go on our Blue Thumb YouTube page, we actually recently made a video tutorial on that. It's a pretty fun method. One of the main things to keep in mind is that different native seeds prefer different, it's called cold stratification period. So it's basically the period of time between when you put them in the milk jug and put them outside and when that seed's going to germinate. Some are going to prefer if you put them outside now. Some are going to prefer it if you put them outside in March. So it'll just require like a little bit of research based on the seeds that you have. Let's see here. So to address Eileen's question, yes, you will get a link to this recording of this webinar afterwards. And when it comes to reviewing all the questions that we're talking about now, we'll post the recording of this, and then we're also going to post a written document of what we have gone through. We may not be including the live portion, but at least the questions that we talked through, we'll have a written transcript of that you can review as well. If you scroll down to the bottom of the grantee guide, it links to an FAQ section. If you want to look at more commonly asked questions. And like always, we have the Hive as another resource to ask questions. We have our program staff and volunteer coaches who are monitoring that regularly. And you can also email the L2L helpline email. Okay, Steve is wondering, we have a bare area under trees. Are there good plants that have season-long bloom? So different native plants have different blooming times. Some have longer bloom time periods than others. If you're wanting to do some research, I recommend trying to find a mix of like some spring blooming plants, some summer blooming plants, some fall blooming plants. That way you kind of cover all your bases, even if none of those plants are going to be blooming through the whole growing season. There's always going to be something that you have blooming. On our plant finder, we have a filter so you can search for plants by bloom time. And on a lot of the like nursery and retailer pages, when you're looking up plants, they'll share that information as well. Someone brings up that if they have excess plants, they'll go on next door and ask who would like them. So that brings up a good point. You can, if you'd like, acquire native plants for your projects through like a neighbor or a trade, we do request that you still give us a list of the plants that you acquired, even if you're not requesting reimbursement for them. The reason for that is because we just need to see that you accomplished the main purpose of your project, which is adding new plants to your site. Is herbicide allowed for site prep? So it won't disqualify you from reimbursement. The program generally doesn't recommend it. However, we do realize that there are some special cases. Maybe you're dealing with some invasive species where that might be one of your only options. So it's not going to disqualify you from reimbursement. If you're not sure and if you want to discuss with us further about your project situation, feel free to email the helpline. Okay, we have somebody asking about a wooded area owned by their city. I'm assuming that it's either adjacent or next to your yard, and wondering if we'd recommend doing a mulch barrier between your yard and that non-maintained land. Yes, that is a great strategy if you're wanting to make sure that weeds or invasives or other non-desired plants, making sure that they don't encroach upon your yard. If you wanted to, you could do some sort of other edging option or like a very small fence barrier between. But that's a good strategy. I don't know, Dan or John, if you have any other thoughts around that.
Yeah, I think that covers it pretty well. That like a heavier layer of mulch might be a good idea between that wooded area, particularly if there's some invasive plants that might be starting to spread into the lawn area.
Yeah. Somebody is making a comment just around the challenge of keeping track of your hours and your spending. So yes, we can definitely reinforce that. It is a lot to keep track of. You're probably going to be making multiple purchases over the coming months, and you're probably going to be, spending pockets of time, and it's easy to lose track of those exact number of hours. As I mentioned earlier, we do have a project tracker spreadsheet that is on the grantee guide. Feel free to use that as a tool, and just kind of document things as you go. It's going to be much easier if you just take a moment in the moment to note, or like keep a place to keep all your receipts rather than scrambling to find everything when you're near that July 15 deadline. We have somebody asking about the jumping worm in Minnesota, and I think I see John typing an answer. It is, it's fairly common at this point. Unfortunately, it is an invasive worm species that has been spreading more in residential gardens over recent years, and it is unfortunate because it does kind of degrade soil, and it is not great with native plants. There are a lot of people doing work around like different strategies to manage jumping worms and kind of work with jumping worms if you do have them in your garden. It's not the end of the world. It's especially like in certain regions of Minneapolis and Rochester. I know a lot of yards have them at this point. I would recommend going to U of M Extension's website. They have a lot of great resources around jumping worms. Okay, we're just about at time here. There's one last question around, is there a list of climate change adaptable plants? That's something that I know our team has been thinking about developing. And there's been kind of research and discussion around how different plants their ranges are changing with climate change. I would say just focus for the purpose of your grant on plants that are considered native to Minnesota right now. And as we mentioned in the kickoff webinar, the two main tools that you can use to kind of verify the native range of a plant are, you can just look it up online, of course, but there's a website called Minnesota Wildflowers, as well as the USDA plants database. And both of those are linked in the grantee guide if you need to double check if a plant is native to Minnesota. Okay, out of respect for everybody's time, I think we're going to stop there. If you had a question that was not answered here tonight, feel free to ask it either in the Hive or the L2L helpline email, and we'll do our best to get an answer to you in a timely manner. Thank you for being here tonight. We really appreciate your care and your curiosity and your commitment to helping out pollinators in our state. We'll be sending out a recording of this within the next couple of days. And other than that, I think we can wrap up. So I hope everybody has a great night.
Thanks, everyone.